Some people become rich because they're smart. Ethan Cole became rich because he stopped caring about people a long time ago. By 39, Ethan had built one of the most powerful tech companies in America from the glass tower that carried his last name across Midtown Manhattan. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Investors called him untouchable. His employees called him terrifying when he wasn't around to hear it. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., his black Escalade stopped in front of Cole Industries, and every morning, the entire building seemed to hold its breath when he walked through the lobby. Ethan never smiled at receptionists, never made small talk in elevators, never attended office birthday parties or charity dinners unless cameras were involved. He believed emotions were distractions and attachments were liabilities, and after years of watching people betray each other for money, status, or convenience, he had convinced himself that love was nothing more than a weakness people invented so they wouldn't feel alone. "Cancel the Seattle acquisition," he said coldly during a Monday morning board meeting, not even looking up from the papers in front of him. "And terminate everyone attached to the failed campaign." The room went silent. One executive nervously cleared his throat. "That division has over 80 employees." Ethan finally looked up, his pale blue eyes empty and unreadable. Then they should have performed better. Nobody argued after that. They never did. By noon, social media was already praising Ethan Cole as a ruthless visionary again, the billionaire CEO who always made the hard decisions nobody else could make. But when the cameras disappeared and the interviews ended, Ethan returned to the top floor of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon he barely tasted, and stood alone in complete silence. No wife, no family, no real friends. Just another night in a home that looked more like a museum than a place where someone actually lived. And the strange thing was, he preferred it that way. At least that's what he kept telling himself. 3 nights later, Manhattan was drowning under freezing rain when Ethan left another investor dinner he hadn't wanted to attend. His driver offered to pull the SUV closer to the entrance, but Ethan waved him off and stepped into the storm alone, irritation already building from the flashes of paparazzi cameras across the street. Then suddenly, someone crashed directly into him. Coffee splashed across the front of his charcoal coat. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," a woman's voice said breathlessly. Ethan looked down, prepared to unleash the same icy glare that made grown men nervous during negotiations, but the words stopped before they left his mouth. She looked exhausted, not glamorous, not polished, just tired in a painfully real way. Damp blonde hair clung to her cheeks from the rain, and dark circles rested beneath soft green eyes that still somehow carried warmth despite the cold weather and obvious stress. She tightened her grip on the little boy standing beside her, probably around 7 years old, wrapped in an oversized winter jacket. "Mom, the bus is coming," the boy whispered anxiously. The woman looked embarrassed as she reached for napkins inside a worn tote bag. "I can pay for the cleaning," she said quickly. I had a double shift, and I wasn't looking where I was going." Ethan stared at her for a second too long. Most people recognized him instantly. Most people either flirted with him, feared him, or tried to impress him. But this woman barely looked at his face. She was too focused on getting her son out of the rain. "It's fine," Ethan said quietly. Even he sounded unfamiliar to himself. The little boy suddenly looked up at him. "You're really tall," he said innocently. Ethan blinked once, caught off guard by the comment. "Liam," the woman murmured, embarrassed. But Ethan surprised himself again. "I've been told that before." For the first time in years, a small smile almost appeared on his face. Almost. Then headlights reflected across the wet sidewalk as the city bus approached the corner. The woman gave him one final apologetic nod before taking her son's hand. "Good night," she said softly. And just like that, she disappeared into the rain. Ethan stood there motionless long after the bus drove away. Water dripped from his coat. Taxi horns echoed through the street. Somewhere behind him, his driver called his name. But Ethan barely heard any of it because for the first time in years, something inside him had cracked, and he didn't understand why. The strange part was not that Ethan kept thinking about the woman from the rain. The strange part was that he could not stop. For 3 days, her face appeared in his mind at the worst possible moments. During meetings, during interviews, even during his morning workouts overlooking the Manhattan skyline from the private gym inside his penthouse. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Ethan Cole was not a man who got distracted by strangers, especially not exhausted single mothers carrying cheap tote bags and rushing to catch city buses. Yet somehow, every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the way she held her son's hand so tightly, like protecting him was the only thing in the world that mattered. "Sir," his assistant, Victoria, repeated carefully from across his office. Ethan looked up sharply. "What?" "I asked if you wanted the final reports before your Chicago flight." Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw, annoyed at himself for drifting again. "Leave them on the desk." Victoria hesitated for a second. She had worked for Ethan long enough to recognize when something felt off. "Are you feeling all right?" "Perfectly." His tone ended the conversation immediately. By Thursday evening, Ethan found himself skipping another networking event and asking his driver to take a longer route through the Upper West Side instead. He told himself there was traffic near Fifth Avenue. He told himself it meant nothing. But deep down, even he knew he was lying. The rain had stopped, but the city still looked silver beneath the streetlights as the Escalade slowed near a small 24-hour grocery store. And then he saw her again. Claire Bennett stood near the entrance wearing a pale blue sweater under a thin coat that clearly was not warm enough for February in New York. She was helping Liam zip his jacket while balancing 2 paper grocery bags against her hip. Ethan stared through the tinted window before he could stop himself. "Pull over," he said quietly. The driver glanced back in surprise but obeyed. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk just as one of the grocery bags split open, sending oranges rolling across the pavement. Claire sighed under her breath and crouched quickly to grab them before they rolled into the street. Ethan moved before he even thought about it. He picked up one of the oranges near his shoe and handed it to her. Claire looked up, startled at first, before recognition crossed her tired face. "Oh," she said softly. "Coffee coat guy." Ethan almost smiled again. "Almost. That is one way to remember me." Liam's eyes widened immediately. "Mom, it is the giant man from the rain." Claire closed her eyes for 1 second in embarrassment. "Liam." "What?" "He is tall." Ethan actually let out the smallest breath of laughter this time, low and unfamiliar in his chest. Claire noticed it too. Her expression softened for a brief second before she quickly looked away. "Thank you," she said as she fixed the torn grocery bag. These things always break at the worst possible moment. Ethan glanced at the thin plastic handles digging into her fingers. "You should not carry all that alone." Claire gave a quiet shrug. Single moms do not really get another option. Something about the way she said it hit him harder than it should have. No self-pity. No performance. Just truth. Cold and simple. Ethan noticed the dark exhaustion beneath her eyes again. The kind that came from years of surviving instead of living. Liam suddenly tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Do you own a basketball team?" Ethan blinked. "No, you look like someone who owns a basketball team." Claire covered her face for a second, mortified. "I am so sorry." "Do not be," Ethan said before he could stop himself. He looked down at Liam. "What makes me look like that?" The little boy shrugged seriously. "You look expensive." For the first time in years, Ethan laughed out loud. A real laugh. Brief, rough, but real enough that even he looked surprised by it. Claire stared at him like she had just witnessed something impossible. Then her phone buzzed suddenly, and the warmth disappeared from her face as she checked the screen. Worry replaced it instantly. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "Everything okay?" Claire forced a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, just life." But Ethan had spent years reading people during billion-dollar negotiations. And he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in Claire Bennett's life, she was carrying it completely alone. For the next week, Ethan told himself he was too busy to think about Claire Bennett again. Coal Industries was preparing for a major merger in Silicon Valley. Investors were demanding interviews, and financial reporters seemed determined to follow his every move across Manhattan. Normally, work drowned everything else out. But now, no matter how many meetings filled his schedule, his mind kept drifting back to a tired blonde woman standing under grocery store lights while pretending everything was fine. And what disturbed him most was not the attraction. Ethan had known beautiful women his entire life. Models, actresses, ambitious socialites who smiled perfectly and said exactly what wealthy men wanted to hear. Claire was different. There was no performance in her. No manipulation. Just exhaustion, quiet strength, and a sadness she tried very hard to hide from her son. Late Friday afternoon, Ethan left his office earlier than usual after canceling another dinner invitation from investors. His driver looked confused when Ethan gave him an unfamiliar address on the Upper West Side. "Sir," the driver asked carefully, "did you need me to confirm the destination?" "No," Ethan stared out the window. "I know where I am going." But the truth was, he did not know why he was going there. 20 minutes later, he stood across the street from a small neighborhood laundromat, glowing beneath faded neon lights. Through the window, he spotted Claire folding clothes while Liam sat nearby at a tiny plastic table doing homework with a crayon in his hand. Ethan should have walked away. Instead, he found himself crossing the street. The small bell above the laundromat door rang softly as he entered. Claire looked up immediately, surprised enough to freeze for half a second. "You again?" she asked softly. Ethan slid his hands into the pockets of his dark coat. Apparently, Liam's entire face lit up the second he saw him. "Mom, it is basketball team guy." Ethan felt that strange, unfamiliar pull in his chest again as the little boy jumped off the chair and walked toward him without hesitation. Children usually avoided Ethan. Most adults did too. But Liam looked at him like he was completely safe. "What are you doing here?" Claire asked carefully. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty laundromat. "I could ask you the same thing." She smiled faintly as she folded another towel. "Pretty sure this is where people do laundry." He almost smiled back. "Almost." Liam tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve again. "Do rich people wash clothes?" Ethan looked down at him, caught off guard. "Sometimes." "Do you have one of those giant washing machines in your house?" Claire sighed quietly. "Liam." "What?" "I am curious." Ethan surprised himself by answering seriously. "Yes." Liam's eyes widened. "That is awesome." Claire shook her head with a tired laugh before brushing loose strands of hair behind her ear. Ethan noticed how pale she looked tonight, more tired than before. "You should be home resting," he said before thinking. Claire gave him a small look of surprise. "That would be nice." She nodded toward the dryers. "But life keeps charging rent." Ethan stared at her for a second too long again. She said things so simply, but somehow every sentence stayed in his head afterward. Liam suddenly held up a worksheet toward Ethan. "I hate math," he announced dramatically. "Can you do multiplication?" Ethan blinked once. "I run a multi-billion-dollar company. So yes." Ethan let out another low laugh before crouching beside the little table. Claire watched silently as Ethan picked up the crayon from Liam's hand and started helping him solve the homework problem. The billionaire who terrified boardrooms around the country now sat inside a laundromat explaining multiplication tables to a 7-year-old boy using crayons shaped like dinosaurs. And somehow, for the first time in years, Ethan felt calm. Not powerful, not admired, just calm. Claire leaned against one of the machines quietly watching them, and something inside her expression softened in a way Ethan noticed immediately. "You are good with kids," she admitted. Ethan looked down at Liam beside him. "No," he said quietly. "I think he is just easy to like." Liam grinned proudly at that before suddenly reaching for Ethan's hand while pointing at the worksheet. The movement was small, innocent, barely noticeable, but the second those tiny fingers wrapped around his hand, something inside Ethan Cole cracked wide open. Because nobody had held his hand like that in longer than he could remember, and for the first time in years, he realized how completely alone he had been. After the laundromat, Ethan told himself he needed distance. Whatever strange connection he felt around Claire and Liam was becoming dangerous. He had spent his entire adult life building control over every part of his world, and now somehow a tired single mother and a little boy with dinosaur crayons were slipping through defenses nobody else had ever touched. But staying away turned out to be impossible. 3 days passed before Ethan found himself staring at Claire's name on a small note inside his office drawer. He had written down the address of the laundromat without even realizing it. That realization irritated him enough to cancel 2 meetings before noon. "Sir, the investors from Boston are waiting," Victoria reminded him carefully from the doorway. Ethan barely looked up from the documents in front of him. "Reschedule." Victoria hesitated. "You never reschedule." "Then they should feel honored." She left quietly after that, but Ethan could feel her confusion lingering in the room. Everyone around him had noticed the shift lately. He was distracted, quieter, less ruthless during meetings. One executive had even walked out of a presentation last week without being fired for the first time in company history. Ethan hated that people were noticing changes he did not understand himself. That evening, Manhattan was wrapped in cold wind again when Ethan stopped outside a small pharmacy near Claire's neighborhood. Through the front window, he spotted her standing near the counter arguing softly with the pharmacist while Liam leaned sleepily against her side. Claire looked exhausted in a way that immediately tightened something inside Ethan's chest. He stepped inside before thinking about it. There has to be another option, Claire was saying quietly. I can pay the rest Friday after my shift. The pharmacist looked uncomfortable but shook his head apologetically. I am sorry. Company policy. Ethan noticed the medicine box on the counter and the fever patches in Claire's basket. Liam looked pale tonight, his cheeks slightly flushed. Ethan moved toward them without hesitation. Is there a problem? Claire turned quickly, surprise flashing across her face. Ethan, hearing his first name from her, did something dangerous to him. Too personal. Too warm. The pharmacist straightened immediately after recognizing him. Almost everyone in New York recognized Ethan Cole eventually. No problem, sir, the man said nervously. Ethan pulled out a black card and placed it calmly on the counter. Add everything she needs. Claire's expression changed instantly. No, Ethan looked at her. No, I am not taking your money. Her voice stayed polite, but firm. Ethan was not used to people refusing him, especially not over something this small. Your son is sick. I know that. Then let me help. Claire shook her head softly. You already have. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan noticed how tightly she held herself together, like pride was the only thing stopping her from falling apart. Most people around wealthy men tried to take whatever they could. Claire fought to keep even a small piece of dignity. And somehow, that affected Ethan more than any carefully rehearsed charm ever could. Liam suddenly tugged weakly on Claire's sleeve. Mom, my head hurts. Ethan saw panic flicker across her face for half a second before she hit it again. That tiny moment broke something inside him completely. Without another word, Ethan handed the pharmacist his card anyway. Run it. Ethan, Claire protested quietly. He looked directly at her, his voice calm but impossible to argue with. I am not doing this for you. She blinked once. Ethan crouched slightly in front of Liam. I am doing it for him. Liam looked miserable but still managed a small smile. You smell expensive again. Ethan actually smiled this time. Fully. Claire noticed immediately, and for a second, she forgot to argue. 10 minutes later, Ethan walked them outside carrying the medicine bag while cold winds swept through the street. Claire pulled Liam's winter hat lower over his forehead before finally looking at Ethan again. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. Ethan should have had an answer. He should have said kindness, responsibility, basic human decency. But none of those were true. The truth was far more dangerous. Because somewhere between laundromat conversations and grocery store accidents and small hands grabbing his without fear, Ethan Cole had started caring about people he barely knew. And that terrified him more than losing billions of dollars ever could. By the following Sunday, Ethan had stopped pretending his interest in Claire Bennett was temporary. Temporary things did not stay in a man's mind at 3 o'clock in the morning. Temporary things did not make him stare out the windows of his penthouse, wondering whether Liam's fever had gone down or whether Claire had finally slept more than 4 hours in a row. It made no sense to him. He had spent years surrounding himself with perfection. Women with flawless makeup and rehearsed smiles. Luxury vacations. Private clubs. Penthouse parties overlooking Manhattan skylines. Yet somehow, none of those memories stayed with him the way Claire's standing under fluorescent pharmacy lights did. And the worst part was how calm he felt around her. That was what truly unsettled him. Sunday afternoon arrived colder than expected, with sharp wind cutting through the streets of the Upper West Side. Ethan had just left a lunch meeting he barely paid attention to when he noticed a familiar figure through the windows of a small neighborhood diner. Claire sat inside a booth near the back, stirring coffee absent-mindedly, while Liam colored on a paper placemat beside her. Ethan should have kept walking. Instead, 5 minutes later, he was standing inside the diner listening to the waitress ask if he wanted a table. Actually, Ethan said quietly, his eyes already finding Claire again. I know someone here. Claire looked up in surprise when he approached the booth. Ethan, Liam nearly bounced out of his seat. Mom, basketball team guy is back. Ethan slid into the opposite side of the booth before he could reconsider the decision. I feel like I should be offended by that nickname eventually. Claire laughed softly, and the sound caught Ethan off guard again. It was warm, real, the kind of laugh people only made when they forgot to be careful for a second. "Sorry," she said. "He gives everyone weird titles." Liam looked proud of himself. "You still look expensive." Ethan shook his head slightly, but there was no annoyance in it anymore. The waitress arrived a moment later looking visibly nervous after recognizing him. "Mr. Cole, can I get you anything?" "Coffee," Ethan answered. Then he glanced at Liam's untouched plate of pancakes. "And another order of those." Claire immediately frowned. "You do not need to buy us lunch." "Good thing I am buying pancakes then." To his surprise, she smiled instead of arguing this time. A small victory. As the waitress walked away, Ethan noticed Claire relaxing slightly across from him. Not completely, just enough to let her guard slip around the edges. Liam kept talking nonstop while coloring dinosaurs blue and green with broken crayons from the restaurant cup. "Mom says I talk too much," he informed Ethan seriously. Claire sighed into her coffee. "Because you do. But you still love me." Ethan looked down at the little boy for a second before answering quietly. "I think she always will." Claire's eyes lifted toward his at those words, and something silent passed between them that Ethan could not fully explain. It was not romance. Not yet. It was something softer. Something more dangerous. Comfort. The pancakes arrived, and Liam immediately poured far too much syrup on them. Claire laughed tiredly while trying to stop him before the syrup spilled across the table. Ethan watched them quietly, something unfamiliar settling deep in his chest. He had attended dinners with senators, celebrities, and billionaires. None of them had ever felt like this. Loud, messy, warm, real. At one point, Claire excused herself to answer a phone call outside the diner, leaving Ethan alone with Liam for the first time. The little boy looked up at him while chewing pancakes thoughtfully. "You like my mom?" Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "That is a strong statement." Liam shrugged. "You look at her the same way moms look at babies." Ethan stared at him in complete silence. "I have no idea what that means." "It means you get soft eyes." Ethan leaned back slowly, unsettled by how accurate that felt. Through the diner window, he watched Claire standing outside in the cold with her arms wrapped around herself while speaking quietly on the phone. Even from a distance, he could see stress written all over her face again. The softness inside Ethan disappeared instantly, replaced by something sharper. Protective, possessive, dangerous in a way he had never experienced before. Because suddenly, more than anything else, Ethan Cole wanted to know who or what kept putting that exhausted look in Claire Bennett's eyes, and he wanted it gone. The phone call outside the diner stayed in Ethan's head long after lunch ended. Claire had returned to the booth smiling for Liam's sake, but Ethan noticed the tension hidden behind it immediately. He noticed everything about her now. The way she rubbed her wrist when stressed. The way she pretended to be fine before quietly drifting somewhere far away in her thoughts. The way exhaustion followed her like a shadow she could never fully escape. And Ethan hated it more than he should have. By Tuesday evening, he was sitting through another meaningless corporate gala at a luxury hotel downtown, while investors praised his latest business deal. Women in designer dresses laughed too loudly around him. Champagne glasses clinked beneath crystal chandeliers. Normally, Ethan could survive these events without effort. Tonight, every second felt unbearable. "You seem distracted," one investor commented carefully. Ethan barely glanced at him. "I am." Across the ballroom, a famous actress was trying to get Ethan's attention with practiced smiles that would have worked on almost any man in New York. Ethan ignored her completely. Because somewhere across the city, Claire Bennett was probably working another double shift while trying to keep her son healthy and fed, and somehow that mattered more to him than everything happening inside this ballroom combined. The realization irritated him enough that he left the gala early again. 40 minutes later, his driver slowed near Claire's apartment building after Ethan gave the address without even thinking about it. But this time, something immediately felt wrong. A man stood near the front entrance talking to Claire, while Liam waited beside her holding a backpack. Ethan's entire body went still the second he saw Claire's expression. She looked uncomfortable, cornered. The man was tall, sharply dressed, probably mid-30s, with the kind of polished confidence Ethan instantly disliked. "Who was that?" Ethan asked quietly. His driver glanced toward the sidewalk. "You want me to find out?" Ethan stared through the tinted glass for one long second before opening the door himself. Cold wind hit him immediately as he crossed the street. Claire noticed him first, surprise flashing across her face. Ethan, the other man turned slowly. Friend of yours? His tone carried a familiarity Ethan hated instantly. Claire looked uncomfortable again. This is Ethan Cole. The man's eyebrows lifted slightly in recognition before he extended a hand. Daniel Harper. Ethan shook it once. Firm. Cold. And you are? Ethan asked. Daniel smiled casually. Claire and I work together at the hospital. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Hospital. So that explained the late shifts and exhaustion. Claire worked as a nursing assistant while raising Liam alone. Somehow knowing that only made the respect growing inside him worse. Liam suddenly ran toward Ethan with an excited grin. You came back. Ethan looked down at him, his expression softening instantly in a way that did not go unnoticed by Daniel. Looks like somebody has competition, Daniel joked lightly toward Claire. Ethan did not smile. Claire looked embarrassed. Daniel was just offering us a ride home. Ethan's eyes shifted back toward the man beside her. In this weather? It is freezing out, Daniel replied calmly. Did not seem right letting her walk. Something dark twisted sharply inside Ethan's chest at the idea of another man taking care of Claire and Liam. The feeling was immediate, primitive, uncomfortable, and completely unfamiliar. Claire noticed the silence between them and quickly stepped forward. We are fine, really. Ethan looked at her. You should not be walking home this late with Liam. Daniel crossed his arms slightly. That is why I offered. Ethan's gaze hardened almost instantly. I was speaking to Claire. The temperature between the two men shifted immediately. Claire looked between them with visible tension. Liam, completely unaware, tugged on Ethan's coat sleeve. Are you mad? Ethan looked down at him and forced his expression to soften again. No, but it was a lie. Because standing there on that freezing sidewalk, watching another man stand too close to Claire Bennett, Ethan Cole realized something dangerous. He was jealous. Not mildly irritated. Not possessive in theory. Truly jealous in a way that felt sharp beneath his skin. And for a man who had spent his entire life believing emotions were weaknesses, the realization hit harder than any business loss ever had. Jealousy was an emotion Ethan Cole had always considered beneath him. Possessive investors became jealous. Insecure men became jealous. Emotional people became jealous. Ethan had spent nearly 4 decades believing he was above all of it. But over the next several days, the feeling followed him everywhere like a slow fire under his skin. Every time he thought about Daniel Harper standing beside Claire outside her apartment building, something inside him tightened sharply. And what made it worse was how little right he had to feel that way. Claire was not his. She had never given him any reason to believe she belonged to anyone at all. Yet Ethan could not stop thinking about another man making her laugh, or helping Liam with homework, or standing too close to her after long shifts at the hospital. The thoughts distracted him enough that he walked out of a board meeting halfway through a presentation Friday morning. Sir? One executive called nervously as Ethan grabbed his coat. We are discussing the merger. Ethan did not even slow down. Then discuss it without me. 30 minutes later, he found himself parked outside St. Vincent Medical Center in Lower Manhattan staring at the revolving hospital doors like a man losing his mind. He had no reason to be there. No excuse. But somehow his body kept bringing him back to Claire anyway. Nurses and doctors rushed through the lobby while rain hit the city in soft gray waves outside. Ethan noticed Claire almost immediately near the reception desk, wearing navy blue scrubs with her blonde hair tied back loosely. She looked exhausted again. But then Daniel appeared beside her carrying 2 coffees, and Claire smiled at something he said. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. It was a small smile. Tired. Grateful. But seeing another man put that expression on her face felt irrationally personal. Before Ethan could stop himself, he walked straight toward them. Claire looked up first, visibly surprised. Ethan. Daniel's expression shifted immediately into polite caution. Mr. Cole. Ethan ignored him completely. You work too much, he said to Claire. She blinked. Excuse me. Ethan glanced briefly at the dark circles beneath her eyes. You look exhausted. Claire crossed her arms slightly. That tends to happen when people have bills. Jealousy was an emotion Ethan Cole had always considered beneath him. Possessive investors became jealous. Insecure men became jealous. Emotional people became jealous. Ethan had spent nearly 4 decades believing he was above all of it. But over the next several days, The feeling followed him everywhere like a slow fire under his skin. Every time he thought about Daniel Harper standing beside Claire outside her apartment building, something inside him tightened sharply. And what made it worse was how little right he had to feel that way. Claire was not his. She had never given him any reason to believe she belonged to anyone at all. Yet Ethan could not stop thinking about another man making her laugh, or helping Liam with homework, or standing too close to her after long shifts at the hospital. The thoughts distracted him enough that he walked out of a board meeting halfway through a presentation Friday morning. "Sir?" One executive called nervously as Ethan grabbed his coat. "We are discussing the merger." Ethan did not even slow down. "Then discuss it without me." 30 minutes later, he found himself parked outside St. Vincent Medical Center in Lower Manhattan, staring at the revolving hospital doors like a man losing his mind. He had no reason to be there. No excuse. But somehow his body kept bringing him back to Claire anyway. Nurses and doctors rushed through the lobby, while rain hit the city in soft gray waves outside. Ethan noticed Claire almost immediately near the reception desk, wearing navy blue scrubs with her blonde hair tied back loosely. She looked exhausted again. But then Daniel appeared beside her carrying 2 coffees, and Claire smiled at something he said. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. It was a small smile. Tired. Grateful. But seeing another man put that expression on her face felt irrationally personal. Before Ethan could stop himself, he walked straight toward them. Claire looked up first, visibly surprised. "Ethan." Daniel's expression shifted immediately into polite caution. "Mr. Cole." Ethan ignored him completely. "You work too much," he said to Claire. She blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan glanced briefly at the dark circles beneath her eyes. "You look exhausted." Claire crossed her arms slightly. "That tends to happen when people have Bill's message delivery timed out. Please try again." Retry? 6 months earlier, Ethan Cole would have laughed if someone told him peace could exist inside a tiny apartment filled with scattered toys, half-finished homework, and the smell of grilled cheese sandwiches at 9 o'clock at night. Back then, peace had meant silence. Empty penthouses. Locked emotions. Distance from everyone. But now, standing in Claire's kitchen while snow fell softly beyond the windows, Ethan realized silence had never actually made him feel less alone. It had only made the loneliness quieter. Liam sat at the small dining table coloring another dinosaur with complete concentration, while Claire moved around the kitchen, wearing one of Ethan's dark sweaters that hung slightly oversized on her frame. The sight hit Ethan in the chest every single time. Not because it was glamorous, because it felt real, warm, permanent in a way his old life never had. Claire glanced over her shoulder and caught him staring again. "You are doing that thing." Ethan leaned against the counter slightly. "What thing?" "Looking at us like you still cannot believe we are here." Ethan's expression softened immediately. "Maybe I cannot." Claire smiled quietly before walking closer. Over the past few months, everything in Ethan's world had changed in ways no board meeting or business deal ever could have prepared him for. He had stepped down from several leadership positions after refusing to let investors dictate his personal life. News outlets called him reckless. Some shareholders called him emotional. Ethan no longer cared, because every night now ended the same way. Claire beside him, Liam laughing somewhere nearby, and for the first time in his life, success no longer felt empty. "Mom," Liam interrupted suddenly from the table. "Can Ethan help me build the volcano tomorrow?" Claire laughed softly. "Science project?" Liam nodded seriously before looking at Ethan. "You promised." Ethan walked over without hesitation. "I remember. You have to make it explode good." Claire pointed a spoon toward her son. "We are not encouraging explosions." "Small educational explosions," Ethan corrected calmly. Liam grinned like Ethan had just become the coolest person alive. Claire watched the interaction quietly, and Ethan noticed that familiar softness in her eyes again. It still affected him every time. Later that night, after Liam finally fell asleep on the couch halfway through a movie, Claire carefully covered him with a blanket while Ethan watched from the doorway. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of snow tapping against the windows. Claire looked up at Ethan once Liam was settled. "He really loves you." Ethan swallowed hard at the quiet truth in her voice. "I really love him too." The words came naturally now. No fear. No hesitation. Claire stepped closer until only inches separated them. "You know," she whispered softly, "there was a time I thought you were the coldest man I had ever met." Ethan let out a quiet breath of laughter. "That makes 2 of us." She reached for his hand gently, and even now, months later, the simple feeling still grounded him in ways he could not explain. What changed? She asked. Ethan looked past her toward Liam, sleeping peacefully beneath the blanket before answering quietly. You did. Claire's eyes filled with emotion immediately. Ethan touched her cheek carefully, his voice lower now. You walked into my life when I did not even realize something was missing. Claire smiled through tears she tried unsuccessfully to hide. You were terrifying, by the way. Ethan nodded once. Fair. She laughed softly again, and the sound still felt like home to him. Then suddenly, a sleepy little voice interrupted from the couch. Are you staying forever? Ethan and Claire both turned toward Liam, who was barely awake beneath the blanket. Ethan walked over slowly before kneeling beside him. Do you want me to? Liam looked at him like the answer was obvious. Yeah. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Because nobody had ever needed him like this before. Not for money. Not for power. Just for him. Liam rubbed his tired eyes once before asking quietly, Can I call you Dad someday? Claire covered her mouth instantly, emotional shock flashing across her face. But Ethan could not speak for several seconds because his entire world had just shifted again in the smallest, softest way possible. Finally, he smiled through the emotion threatening to break his voice apart. You can call me whatever makes you happy, buddy. Liam smiled sleepily before falling back asleep almost immediately. Ethan stayed there beside the couch for a long moment, one hand resting gently against the blanket while snow continued falling outside the apartment windows. Claire stepped beside him quietly, slipping her hand into his again. And standing there in that tiny apartment with the woman he loved and the little boy who trusted him completely, Ethan Cole realized something that would have terrified the old version of himself. He no longer wanted control. He no longer wanted distance. For the first time in his life, all he wanted was this.